Morning, everyone. We'll call the Special Assessments Task Force to order this morning, and we'll have take roll. I know there are two that will be calling in. Are we live on the phone? One's on. Okay, who is on? Jeff, Mr. Volk is on the phone. I expect Mr.
Yes, I am.
It was Jeff?
That was Jeff.
Deanna, do you want to take the roll?
Yes.
Mr. Bullis?
Here.
Mr. Busick?
Yes.
Mr. Christensen? Ms. Palm Connor? Mr. Cosgrove? Mr. Dabbert? Mr. Dardis?
Here.
Ms. Kremsted? Tony Gehrig?
Here.
Tony Grinberg?
Here.
Mr. Gorosky?
Here.
Mr. Hanson? Mr. Volk?
Here.
Mr. Worth?
Okay, just as a point of order, meetings now are being recorded. So we ask that you have the microphone in front of you when you speak, so the minutes and the audio and video is recorded accordingly. Which is not on the agenda, but I'd ask for a motion discussion on the minutes from the prior meeting. I hope everyone had a chance to read through those so we can acknowledge and formally accept those minutes. Moved by Christie. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Bullis. Discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Next up, comments. Before we move into our presentations today, any comments, thoughts from the first meeting? Move right into it? All right. Mr. Shockley, Special Assessment History and Overview.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to come and present to the committee. Just wanted to give kind of a disclaimer as I get started. I'm not here representing any specific party, not here for any specific purpose, not here to give any policy direction or initiative. Just wanted to give you some background on how special assessments, the process works from a procedural standpoint, and then some of the issues that I've seen over time. So it's really, truly, the purpose is just to provide some information and background to the committee. Feel free to ask questions. I prefer to have an interactive presentation, so if there's something that really triggers a question, just feel free to interrupt and ask the question. I actually prefer that. So, and I'm just going to jump right in. I have a lot of experience working, and the firm has a lot of experience working with public entities. I'm going to focus today on North Dakota cities. My background with public entities represent West Fargo, work with Moorhead, Jamestown, Bismarck, Williston on bonding and special assessments. So I kind of have a broad base. I've also represented private developers in the areas that we don't work with the public entities in the Devil's Lake area, western North Dakota and western Minnesota. I kind of feel like I have a little bit of view from both sides of the table, so to speak, and how developers perceive the development process and how cities perceive the development process. Part of the question that the chair had posed was a little bit of what's the history of special assessments, and so I'm naturally been curious about the history of special assessments and the research I've done over the years, and just reconfirming it in the last couple of days. Special assessments predate both the U.S., they're found in the United States, they were found in the American colonies and in England. It appears that they originated in 13th century England with some cases regarding draining swamps and especially assessing residents around swamps for the drainage. So special assessments have been with us for a long time. They were used in the American colonies before the Declaration of Independence, and they really became commonplace in American cities in the early 1900s. We found some case law regarding a little bit of history that was written by a judge who went into extensive discussion regarding the history of special assessments in the United States and he had referenced that the power to levy a special assessment was given to the Corporation of New York in 1691 and has been conferred upon nearly every city. You'll note that case was in 1857, so that was well before the founding of North Dakota. From a 30,000-foot level, the United States Constitution limits the amount that a city can levy for a special assessment to the value that benefits the property. And at a very fundamental level, when a municipality levies a special assessment, it can't exceed the benefit, otherwise that's viewed as a taking. It has to be more than the benefit levied to the property, and you'll see the case law over the centuries has interpreted how we apply what the benefit is versus the assessment. States and cities can create law codifying the scope of the special assessments. In North Dakota, we have a statutory scheme allowing special assessments to be levied. Many states throughout the country allow cities to develop their own process for levying special assessments. So they have very sophisticated ordinances that set forth the procedures and how special assessments will be undertaken. Underlying all of that is the fundamental rule that the assessment cannot exceed the benefit. When we did a survey of all 50 states, we found that nearly every state had some form of special assessment authority within its toolbox for state and local governments. Now, that doesn't mean that every state uses them the same way that we use them in this area. It's just simply every state appears to have the tool available for the assessment. And most states have authorized them through either statute or through their state constitution. There's another fundamental legal issue, and state courts uniformly recognize the difference between a general tax and a special assessment. And I found that this comes up often, that people don't understand the difference. General tax is a tax that's levied across the city as to valuation. You'll hear this, it's a GO levy, it's a mill rate, and it applies equally across based upon the value of your home. A special assessment is based upon the benefit conferred to your property. So you can have a property that receives a $50,000 assessment, but it might only be valued at $10,000 because you look at the benefit accruing to the property, not a general tax. And the courts have also held that you can't have a special assessment that looks like a general tax. So take, for example, put a small road through a community and you try to levy an equal assessment across the entire community for a small local road. The courts would invalidate that, saying that's a general tax. And so that's why cities will create smaller improvement districts to limit the area that actually benefits from the improvement. Otherwise, it could be viewed as a general tax. There are a few exceptions to having citywide assessments. Small towns sometimes will install a water tower or a lagoon, and they'll levy it across the entire community because they only have one lagoon cell or they only have one water tower, and so they'll levy an equivalent unit on each lot. And so that's as you get into your discussions about policy, you have to make sure that your assessment doesn't look like a general tax, otherwise the courts will invalidate it. Found that if you're interested, there's a lot of case law on the difference between generic taxes and special assessments. I'm just gonna go through that. As you noted in your minutes, and what we found, 1887, 1886 is really the first references that we were finding in North Dakota law for special assessments. I'm going to go through the procedure of how cities levy special assessments in North Dakota, so please feel free to jump in if you have any questions. The procedures for levying special assessments are set by statute, and the legislature from time to time has added provisions into that procedure. I would note two things. First of all, cities can go beyond what is legally required for special assessments, as for notices, as for additional meetings. The statute set forth the basic legal requirements, and cities are certainly allowed to go above and beyond that for notice provisions. However, you're still limited by the case law that the benefit can't, or the assessment cannot exceed the benefit. The procedures for levying special assessments are set forth in 4022, 4023, 4024, 25, and 26. There's a lot of case law interpreting these sections. And so if you'll read the statute, but there's also interpreting case law regarding how that's applied. And so oftentimes when you ask a question, it's based upon facts because the statute sets forth a general rule, and then there's specific factual instances in which somebody has challenged what the city has undertaken. There are numerous types of improvements that cities can use special assessments for. I'll just cover a few of them: water and sewer, streets, oversizing of water mains, sewer mains, water towers, lagoons, sidewalks. There is a whole laundry list of improvements, and it's covered in 402201. It really becomes a legislative decision for the city commission to decide if you want to undertake an improvement through the use of a special assessment district. Oftentimes, cities will have a discussion about how are we going to improve the sewer line? Are we going to use utility rates, or are we going to create a sewer improvement district? You can use special assessments for that, and so this just assumes that we're using an improvement district to pay for the sewer project or water project. Once the city commission has made a decision that it wants to move forward with this, creating an improvement district and assessing out the improvement, needs to create an improvement district. The city commission, generally with the advice of the city engineer and the city attorney, will form the size of the improvement district. And the size of the improvement district is critical for the reason I said before, in that some improvements you can only assess to a certain area that benefits. And so the city engineer will carefully look at the type of the improvement and the area in the community and create an improvement district. And sometimes residents will feel that those lines aren't exactly fair, but it's generally based upon a policy that's been adopted by the city and how they'll apply that policy to a different type of an improvement. It's really easy with the greenfields development where you have new residential infrastructure, you know the subdivision and the improvement district size and shape. That's very easy. It gets more difficult when you're doing oversized infrastructure. How far out do you extend that assessment boundary? Typically for your collector and arterial streets, you'll go out a half a mile to a mile for most communities. And so at some point, you have to draw the line, and you'll have residents on one side of the street maybe paying an assessment, and on the other side, they're not paying the assessment. And the North Dakota legislature recently required that cities have written policies if they're above, I believe it's above 2,500 people, to have a written policy to justify why they undertake the improvement districts the way they have. The next step in the process is the city commission requests an engineer's report and estimated cost. That just describes the nature of the improvements and the estimated cost. That is delivered to the city commission. That sets forth some specific rules regarding how much cost can be assessed to the district through a contracting procedure. Just for background, the overall cost for the contract can exceed 40% of the underlying engineer's estimate for the district. Doesn't happen a lot, but we saw that happen sometimes in western North Dakota during the oil boom. The engineer would put together an engineer's cost estimate, we'd bid it out, and 4 months later, the bid came back 60% higher than the engineer's estimate, and we'd have to go back and rebid it. The city commission then accepts the engineer's report, and then for street projects and some other types of projects, you need what is called a resolution of necessity. And that is a resolution by the city commission declaring that the project is necessary and setting forth a public hearing for residents to appear and to file protest to prevent the project. Those are not needed for sanitary sewer and water projects. The reason is very straightforward. Sanitary sewer and water projects are deemed to be public health issues. And so it was viewed by the legislature when they originally drafted this section that the public should not be able to prohibit the city commission or city council's determination that public health needed to have sewers and water projects installed. It doesn't mean that the commission has to go forward and not do a resolution of necessity. It's just not required. So the city commission could obviously require a resolution of necessity for those projects also, but it's just simply not required by law. Public hearing then occurs for the resolution of necessity. An improvement can be stopped by a protest of 51% of the area or greater. It's not by resident number, it's by area. And I like to use the illustration that if we had an improvement district that encompassed 2 quarter sections, one property owner owned 1 quarter section and 1 acre on the other quarter section, and then the one developed quarter section had 160 residents in that development, and they said no to the improvement, but the landowner that owned the majority of the land said it was fine to go forward. The improvement district could go forward and wouldn't be protested out. So it's based upon area, not upon the sheer number of individuals who own property. The next step in the process is the request for plans and specs that goes from the City Commission to the City Engineer. I would note that this can occur prior to the resolution of necessity. Oftentimes, cities will request their engineer to prepare plans and specs so that they're available and they understand the costs before they set a resolution of necessity. So if there's questions from developers or from the public, they can see what the engineers are proposing. The next step is to approve the plans and specs submitted by the engineer. Then the next step is project is publicly bid. All improvement districts any work in an improvement district, regardless of cost, is required to be publicly bid. I've had a few improvement districts where the threshold for the construction contract was under the state requirements. At the time was $100,000 for public bids. The project was only $40,000, but the statute on special assessments requires the public bidding of any improvement district project. Then the City Commission or City Council would go ahead and award the contract. Once you're reaching close to being completed or substantially completed, that's when you start to specially assess. And that's probably more important to this task force, but I thought it was important to understand procedurally how we get to the special assessment process. So the first step in the assessment process is the City Commission directs the Special Assessment Commission to levy special assessments. And that is a number that is given to the Special Assessment Commission to levy out to the district. Most cities will levy 100% of the district or of the improvement cost to the district. Some cities will utilize sales tax or other revenues to essentially buy down that total cost. And so, for example, if you had a large street project that was $10 million and the city had $2 million of sales tax available for the project, they would buy down the assessment by $2 million and then direct the Special Assessment Commission to levy out $8 million. That's important because that directs the Special Assessment Commission as to how much they will actually levy out. The Special Assessment Commission, they have to be a minimum of 3 people that are appointed to levy and approve special assessments and determine the benefits. Certainly a city can expand the number of people on their Special Assessment Commission, but by statute, 3 people are required to serve. The Special Assessment Commission's job is to determine the amount of benefits and the assessments. In prior versions of the statute, they were actually required to go out and investigate and view each and every parcel and come to the determination of benefits. Case law has subsequently interpreted that to mean they don't have to actually go out and view every single individual property to determine the benefits. However, they should be generally familiar with the improvement. So what's the case law behind determining what a valid special assessment is? There are 3 specific requirements. The special assessment or special benefit accruing to each lot or parcel from the improvement must be derived. And that means that the Special Assessment Commission must look at the nature of the improvement and then the type of a property and determine how much benefit actually accrues to that property from the improvement. Second, the special assessment levied must be limited to its just proportion of the total cost of the improvement. That means that the special assessment will be different, likely different or the same than the benefit, never greater, but it has to be levied on that property and limited to its proportion of the overall total cost. So even, I'll use a crazy example, we'll say one property benefits 90% from the improvement, but the assessment, the way it was structured, not 90% of the assessment should be levied against that lot. So you have, the Special Assessment Commission has to weigh out those factors also. Finally, the assessment must not exceed the benefit, which has been determined to have accrued therefore. That's the basic rule that the Supreme Court announced. Your assessment can't exceed your benefit. Now, the tricky part is, and I'll jump into another slide. Got out of order here. So the Special Assessment Commission, from a procedural standpoint, meets and determines the benefit using those three criteria. Then it publishes the list. By law, it's required to publish the list and hold a public hearing. At the hearing, the Special Assessment Commission can alter the assessment, or it can confirm the list, or it can alter the assessment and confirm the list. The Special Assessment Commission is one of the relatively unique committees in a city structure in that they actually have independent decision-making authority. They're not like a planning and zoning board, which simply makes recommendation. The Assessment Commission actually gets to make decisions. Once they've made their decision, a notice of confirmation is published in the newspaper. Some cities will go ahead and put out special notices to individual property owners. They're not required to, but this is the minimum required by state law. Any person aggrieved by the decision can file a notice of appeal. They should state specifically what the purpose or nature of their appeal is. And then the city commission or city council would hear those appeals. Technically, to have a valid appeal, a written notice needs to be filed by the assessor prior to the meeting before the city commission or city council. My experience has been that most city commissions and city councils will still hear appeals even if somebody shows up in the audience and has not previously filed a notice of appeal. I think that's important. There's sometimes a perception that city commissions or city councils aren't helpful, trying to be helpful to landowners, but in my experience, most of them, even though the landowner may not have procedurally correctly followed the procedure, they still want to be fair to the landowner and give them an opportunity to be heard in front of the city commission or appeal. Once again, the city can add additional steps or notices to the process. Some cities do, some cities don't. Finally, if a landowner is not happy, they may appeal to a district court. Once they appeal to the district court, it leaves the city and then it goes to district court. The appeal period for landowners is short. It's only 30 days. The review standards are very high for a landowner to overcome. It's what's called arbitrary, capricious, or unreasonable. And that really means that the city has to have gotten it wrong either on the law or the facts. Most assessments have been upheld by the courts in North Dakota. The few instances in which they have not been upheld are, number one, the city got the law or the procedure wrong. That's an easy one for the judge to turn it around on and say you didn't follow the procedure properly. The remedy is the judge ships it back to the city to redo the assessment. The other is factually they missed some type of an issue. There was one case that came out of Cass County in which the landowner had indicated to the city that they were going to plat property. The city went ahead and levied the special assessment based upon the land being platted. The last minute, the landowner pulled the plat and then challenged the assessment, saying that it was invalid because the land wasn't platted. The judge agreed and kicked the assessment back to the city, which promptly reassessed it based upon it being non-platted property. So in the end, the assessment was still upheld. It just had to be procedurally proper. The courts also presume that assessments are valid. So there's a presumption by the court system that all assessments are valid as soon as they reach the judge's desk. The reason that assessments are presumed valid is an inherent discretion and deference that is given by the judicial branch to the legislative branch. The courts don't like to upset what you as policymakers and city commission members and city council members do. And so the judge tries to presume that the assessments are valid. That doesn't mean that presumption can't be overcome. It's just something to keep in mind that all assessments are presumed valid. However, the legislature carved out an exception to that general rule. True agricultural land has a de novo review, which means the court gets to look at the assessment all over again. I'm not familiar with any property owners that have challenged it using this statute. To be frank, there's not a lot of true agricultural property that's been assessed. It's usually land that is subject to development that is coming into the city. What can be included in a special assessment district? Generally, the highest proportion of cost is construction costs, and I use 70%. What I've typically seen is between 65 to 75% is construction. Engineering, construction management, inspections, land acquisition, bond issuance, and capitalized interest, administrative and legal costs, all perfectly legal to include within the assessment district. Some case law came out of the city of Fargo, Hector versus City of Fargo. The court said a North Dakota city may include engineering fees, legal fees, capitalized interest costs, and other project costs within the amount to be specially assessed. Very broad authority, and so it really allows a city to include all of its reasonable costs related to the project in that district. That doesn't mean from a policy perspective that the city can't decide, well, we want to reduce the amount of engineering fees, or we want to reduce the bond issuance costs. That's a policy decision, but legally cities can include all of those costs within there. So what are the main methods of assessments? And the methods of assessment are generally followed throughout the state, and they have really been vetted through the courts. And so almost every city uses the three that I'm about to go over. And that's front footage, which is the first, and that's used with roads. So that is literally you take the cost of the road and that you divide up the amount of linear front footage in front of each lot. And the cost is then assessed on a linear foot basis. So if your lot has 100 front feet, it receives a higher assessment than your neighbors who has a 25-foot lot or a 50-foot lot. Square foot, that's generally used for drainage or storm sewer projects. The basis is the rain falls, and the larger your lot, the larger your assessment should be. There's some variances to each of these formulas, but these are the three basic formulas. The equivalent unit, that simply means that each parcel gets an equivalent unit. So that's generally used for water service or sewer service. Apartment buildings generally have an equivalent unit assigned based upon the number of units that are in the apartment building. Most cities will assign a 0.8 equivalent unit or 0.6 equivalent unit for each apartment unit within the building. So if you had a building with 100 apartment units in it, it might get 80 equivalent units or something similar to that. The idea being that one house produces about the same, slightly more water or sewage use than an apartment. And that really comes into a determination between the engineer looking at actual water usage as they develop their policy. And cities vary on that, and it depends upon the city. Some cities have very few apartment buildings, and the local engineers can tell you precisely, and the city staff can tell you precisely how much water that building uses. You get into larger cities, it's more difficult, and they've developed their own formulas. The Special Assessment Commission deals with a lot of other issues. Typically, they try to adjust the assessments based upon these three general parameters. They'll reduce or adjust the assessments for unplatted areas. Typically, what I've seen in areas that are unplatted, that are about to be developed, the city or the assessment commission and the city engineer's office will apply a discount factor. That means that any of the property that would be required to be dedicated for plats is not included in the calculation. So we'll go back to our vacant quarter section of land. We would apply either a 80% or a 75% reduction in the total land area before we start calculating square foot and front footage just for the required dedication of roads and infrastructure. The idea being that the landowner should not pay special assessments for those areas that are going to be dedicated for future right-of-way. There are also some other unique issues of land. Sometimes you'll be along a river where you're trying to impose a storm sewer assessment, where you'll have to take into account the different drainage, how the water drains to the river and to the road. Those are usually dealt with the Special Assessment Commission. I will say, I tell every Special Assessment Commission they have one of the toughest jobs because nobody likes to be assessed. The length of time for assessment, my understanding is that in the next couple of meetings, Kent Costin, the finance director, is going to be going through Fargo's specific times for assessments. These are the minimums that you can go to by state law. So for streets, sewer, and water service, you can go to a maximum of 30 years. I only know of a couple cities in the state that have actually used a full 30 years through their assessments. Typically, we're seeing between 20 to 25 years for the total length of assessment. In some of the smaller communities that have required USDA financing, they will go to a 30-year assessment for affordability reasons. USDA provides grants and low-interest loans for communities that are of certain need or level. And as part of the improvement district, they'll get a grant for 40% of the district, and then they assess out other 60%, and then they will levy the assessment over a period of 30 years to make it more affordable for the residents. What is the interest rate that you can charge on specials? I know this is always a question that comes up. By state law, you can go up to 1.5% over the average net annual interest rate of the bonds. So a little bit of background, when the city issues bonds to pay for these improvements, it gets an average net annual interest rate at the sale of the bond. The city is then permitted by law to go 1.5% above that rate as it calculates its assessment on each individual lot. So once the Assessment Commission determines a principal amount to be assessed on a lot, usually the city's finance staff go back and they allocate that lot. We'll say it's a $10,000 assessment. They add the assessment or add the interest rate to the assessment, and then they amortize that over the period of the assessment. And so it's just like any other loan, you have to have an interest rate assigned to it, and the city can go 1.5% above it. Residents always have the option of prepaying that full amount and saving that interest. So the question comes up very often in front of city commissions and city councils: why does state law allow us to go up to 1.5%? And once again, I qualify that cities don't have to go up to 1.5%. This is just what's allowed by law. The 1.5% allows the city to be protected in the event that you have an assessment district in which you have late payments being made. So if you have a number of property owners that are making late payments on their special assessments, that doesn't stop the city's obligation to pay on the bond. And so the city is still obligated to make debt service payments, and if they don't make debt service payments, it's considered an event of default, which can have dramatic effects on a city's credit rating. And so the concept or idea behind the 1.5% threshold is that that additional interest will help make up for any potential late payments. Typically in North Dakota, most people like to pay their bills, so we don't see a very high rate of late payments, but it can range anywhere from in cities from 1 to 4 or 5%. Delinquencies, same issue. Sometimes you'll have people that just don't pay their special assessment, and the city is still required to make payments on the bonds. And so it's important to have that extra money accruing in that fund to protect the city in the event of a delinquency. And this can become really important if you have a downturn in housing. Sometimes developers will have to make an economic choice along with their bank to walk away from a development, that they're not selling enough lots, that they're not, for whatever reason, the bank's interest rate is too high, the bank won't work for them. They make an economic decision and they have to walk away from the development. And it takes time for the lots to work back through the process. They'll either get sold tax forfeit or returned to the city. The additional 1.5% helps protect the city so that the city has funds to make the debt service during that time. If you don't have that money available, you have to draw from your general funds of the city, which can have negative impacts on your general services such as police and fire. The other issue that the 1.5% is used for is prepayments. Often bonds that are sold for special assessment districts are structured with what are called later call dates. And a call date means that's the date upon which the bond can be called and prepaid. And typically, a financial advisor for a city will recommend a later call date because that reduces the overall interest rate, because the person buying the bond wants to have a guaranteed investment flow for a set period of time. If you got rid of all your call dates, your interest rate would be higher, so it's a financial decision that's made by the financial advisor and usually the city finance staff to obtain lower interest rates. Most bond issues have between a 5 and an 8-year call feature. So if you have a number of large properties that have assessments on them and they prepay early, the city is not collecting the interest from those properties, but it still has to pay the interest on the bonds. I did have one entity that had a large prepayment on a bond issue that was about $10 million. They had a large prepayment of $3 million from a property owner, which everybody thought that'd be great. The city actually had to take from its general funds until the rest of the fund could catch up from the other property owners. So prepayments are good, but sometimes they're not so good depending on how big they can be. Recognizing that Kent is going to be talking more about your finances, I just had one quick slide about refunding improvement bonds and why we use special assessments compared to issuing revenue bonds for improvements. The reality is it's a lower cost of capital compared to revenue bonds. Generally, the interest rates are lower, and this goes to reconstructs rather than new construction. So if you're reconstructing a street or a water and sewer feature, it's generally cheaper to issue an improvement bond rather than a revenue bond. They don't require a reserve. Typically with a revenue bond, a reserve requirement is required, and what that means is the city has to set aside up to 10% of the total bond issue in a reserve, can't do anything with those funds. And so it makes it harder for the city to borrow money, and it's a higher cost of capital. The other issue is with special assessment bonds, you can bond up to 100% of the special assessment revenue compared to revenue bonds, which can require up to 150% debt coverage. For some smaller communities, that's even higher because the market doesn't have a lot of confidence that the revenue is going to stay stable, and so they like to see a higher debt service coverage ratio than even 150%. The state has some programs that allow you to go down to 120%, but I've never heard of 100% revenue coverage ratio because that's just too risky, because the revenue streams, they go up and they go down. And this applies to sales tax bonds too. You have a lot of the same problems with sales tax bonds in that they require a reserve amount and they also require debt service coverage ratios. One important factor about refunding improvement bonds is they're strictly payable out of a special assessment district. So after this city levies a special assessment, all of the assessments are collected from the district, they're paid into a fund, and that's used to pay the bonds. It's important to note that as a city grows, it means the city takes in more revenue for the special assessment district, but it doesn't benefit the city. So as you grow and you add more bonds, it's not like the city is getting richer because all the money is being pledged to pay off the bonds. It looks, from a budget standpoint, your budget is growing, but your net value isn't. So one of the items that I wanted to touch upon was two major areas of special assessments that I've seen. And I separated them into greenfields and then reconstructs. And I think this is probably along the lines of one of the issues that your task force is going to be considering. So greenfields to me involve a new road in an undeveloped area, oversized regional infrastructure for new development, and then new development. Whereas reconstruction, that's your typically reconstruction of your older parts of town. You might need to rebuild Main Street. Each of these have two different important issues. And so as you start thinking about how are we going to develop a policy, I think it's important to set each one in a different bucket because each one has impacts and advantages and disadvantages to how you set a policy for the city. So I'm going to address greenfield issues first. As in the metro area, we've seen a tremendous amount of growth, and I really divide it into what are the advantages and disadvantages if a city levies special assessments for local infrastructure versus having the developer do it. And so from an advantage standpoint, when the city goes ahead and levies special assessments for a greenfield development, the city can control the engineering, construction, and management oversight of the project. Oftentimes, the city engineering departments like to make sure that the infrastructure, the roads, the water and the sewer, the sidewalks, they're all constructed to city standards. Using city assessments allows the city engineering staff or outside engineer to really have control over what that infrastructure looks like. The size of the pipe, the depth of the pipe, the location of the pipe, making sure it matches up to the rest of the city infrastructure. Whereas if the developer installs that themselves, the city has a degree of losing control over that. One advantage, and once again, this is just one of my observations over time, the developer doesn't have the carrying costs that they would if they had to bring in their own capital to install the infrastructure. And I think as a developer representing developers, that's pretty critical. It is hard to bring capital to the table. One of the common issues that developers have with banks that I've seen is banks have rules on how much they can lend for development. And as a result, they only have so much capital available that they can put into the project. If they have to put all their capital into infrastructure, it limits the size and amount of developers that can actually do it. Growth, once again, this is just an observation. When the city uses special assessments for localized infrastructure in greenfields, there's growth opportunity. So you have more development and a lot more smaller developers, because it goes right back to the cost of capital issue. Smaller developers are able to enter the market and be more competitive. Disadvantages, city debt issuance of refunding improvement bonds. As we just discussed, the city would issue the bonds and be responsible for paying them. If you're not collecting special assessments, the city is still on the hook. And so from probably the major disadvantages, the city is incurring debt and taking on that risk of non-payment. It typically requires the city to have some sort of security in the event of default, which puts city commissions and city councils in somewhat of a political pickle, I like to say, because in a perfect world, the city would have 100% security from the developer for the payment of special assessments that would say that until you get a house built on that lot, you're going to guarantee that you're going to pay the special assessments. That's not reality, and the city has to come to some arrangement with the developer regarding what that security is, and that can put a city commissioner, a city council in a somewhat of a bind in how do we set a policy for what that security level is. And setting that security level has impacts on who can enter the market and who can't, and it also requires policy level decisions about what are the qualifications for developers. There's also administration of project and potential market distortions. So there are as a cost to the city to administer all of the projects and to issue the debt. Clearly there's administrative costs. Those can be included within the assessment district, but with the pressure that you're hearing from the public, including those costs in the project can present a challenge. And so that's another challenge for a city. And then potential market distortions. If you have developers in your community that install all the improvements on their own, and then you have developers that utilize the city to install special assessments, it's very hard for the people that are installing the assessments themselves to market the lots as compared to the lots with specials. And I'm not really sure why that occurs, but it's something that I've seen throughout the market. There may be some real estate agents that can provide more in-depth analysis on why that is occurring, but it does occur. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of having developer-funded greenfield improvements? Well, the clear advantage is the city doesn't have to issue any debt. Very clear, city doesn't have to take on the risk, doesn't have to take on the risk of a default, doesn't have to take on the risk of making sure special assessments are paid. Typically, a developer has lower engineering costs than the city. I'm not 100% sure why this is occurring. I think part of it is the developer puts a lot of pressure on its engineering firms to keep the design costs down. I don't know if it's better or worse engineering, but that's what I've seen. There's no specials for new homeowners when the developer installs it. All the costs for the infrastructure is included within the price of the lot. This is I included this as an advantage. I'm not sure if it is, but the developer doesn't have to follow public bidding laws. And so they're not required to go out and take the lowest responsible bidder. Those of you who have been in private industry know that some contractors are better than others, and their price may not necessarily reflect that. The better contractor may not always be the lowest bid, and private developments are allowed to utilize whatever contractor they want to. And so sometimes the quality of the infrastructure can be better, not necessarily. No payment or performance bonds. It reduces the overall cost of the development. Typically, when you publicly bid a project, the city is required to have the contractor carry a payment and a performance bond. A payment bond is in place so that all of the subs get paid. A subcontractor on a public job can't get a lien against city property. It's just not permitted by law, so you're required to carry a payment bond. Performance bond ensures that the contractor will perform the work that's required in a district. Typically, these bonds can add anywhere from 1 to 1.5% to the project cost. There's a whole industry of payment and performance bonds. They charge a certain fee to have the payment and performance bonds issued, and it just adds a small cost to the project. There are benefits to having them, even for private developers. Sometimes private developers will require performance bonds on big projects. Disadvantages, you have a lot of loss of control by the city over the design. Sometimes the sewers, sometimes the water connections aren't properly sized. They aren't sized the right capacity. They aren't hooked in properly. They are put in the wrong locations. I know one developer that would prefer to put plastic piping in for storm sewers rather than concrete piping. I'm not an engineer, but there is a big difference between the quality of the PVC versus the concrete. Economic recession, and I note this from what do you do when you have an economic recession? And during the last housing crisis in 2008 and 9, Minneapolis area uses the private development route where most developers install all of their infrastructure themselves. When the economic recession hit, developers went bankrupt. They had housing developments that were quarter sections with 10 homes completed in it, and there were tumbleweeds blowing through the half-completed streets. Even though it was a private development, guess who those residents looked to come in and fix it? It was the cities. And so a banker in a small town once told me that when nobody else is able to do it, the city has to step in. And so to me, it's a disadvantage that you're taking the risk that the developer is going to be able to finish the improvements, because ultimately the residents are going to look to the city to finish them if they're unable to. And so as an attorney, we always look at worst case scenarios, and that was one instance in which it was a worst case scenario. And there was a lot of legal issues that arose about the right of the city to step into the development because the developer went bankrupt. The bank was still involved and had liens against the property, and the city just wanted to step in and make sure they were maintaining water service and completing the streets to the few residents that were out in the area. Another disadvantage is less developers have access sufficient to capital for development. This can lead to less lots for the public and higher prices. I look at this as a potential disadvantage in that every homeowner we want to make sure that we're encouraging home ownership. It's good for the community, but it can lead to higher prices and less developers because it takes a lot of capital to do this on your own. Developers are risk adverse. We're seeing out in western North Dakota right now with the increase in the oil production, a demand for additional housing. There are not a lot of new developments starting out there. It's in the Williston and Minot area. They typically require the developer to install the improvements themselves. The developers that I've spoken to are worried that there'll be another economic downturn. And so they're risk adverse to investing additional money to put in a development, but the city needs the housing infrastructure for its residents. So it's a disadvantage in that if as a community you want to encourage housing for your community and your residents, sometimes developers are just, either the banks or developers are risk adverse. They've seen issues and downturns before. They don't want to go ahead and invest the money. The other big issue is city inspections are still required to hand over the infrastructure. So you still have to require the city to inspect the infrastructure before it'll accept it. So you run into many issues regarding the quality of the construction and how will the city take it over, who has the warranty, is it properly constructed? What if it's not properly constructed and the developer refuses to remedy the issue? There's a whole host of issues that come into having the developer privately install the infrastructure. You still have regional infrastructure costs. So even if you make the developer install the localized infrastructure, you still have those collector streets, you still have the oversized infrastructure costs. So the reality is the city is still going to need to pay for those big ticket items outside of what the developer does. How can we mitigate our risks? Typically, as we discussed before, cities, when they use special assessments, will require a developer's agreement with security. So in the event of in the event of a default, city typically draws on a letter of credit. Locally, I think most cities are between 30 and 50% for a letter of credit. City plans and specs assure that proper infrastructure and connections. And the other is really a policy decision. You thoughtfully control the number of lots to be developed, and you sort of have to put the brake on how many lot developments you're going to allow through, and that's how you can mitigate your risk from a policy standpoint of having too many special assessments out there and too much special assessment debt. So how do you mitigate your risk that we've identified with developer installed local infrastructure? You have to have a very stringent developer agreement setting milestones and step-in rights to the city. This requires a paradigm change where your city attorney would be putting a lot of time into development agreements and specifically working through with the developers. And then you have to require the developers to have security to finish the infrastructure in the event that there's an economic downturn. And you have to be able to address the nuisance issues, who's going to be out there mowing, cleaning up, things like that. And then other issues covered in your agreement. Reconstruction. It's difficult to levy special assessments on existing homeowners and businesses for 100% of the costs. This is probably where we hear the most complaint from residents, that you're reconstructing an area and the city needs to cover its costs. If city has other sources of revenue, it can supplement them. Typically, we're seeing sales tax or utility revenues. However, these sources have very limited capacity to overall needs. A lot of the local cities are seeing for reconstruction needs between $10 to $30 million of reconstruction needs, and the sales tax just aren't able to support those issues. Same way with the utilities. They just don't have the capacity to support it unless you really increase your utility rates, which can have negative effects on some of your older residents that are living in apartment buildings or other fixed income facilities. There's also sometimes legal restrictions. Most sales taxes are passed with a ballot initiative, and the voters vote on a specific purpose for the sales tax, and therefore the city is restricted in how it's going to use the sales tax. So I came up with a couple of alternative models. Looking at different states, you could have state direct aid to cities for reconstruction and oversized infrastructure, and this sort of sets aside the greenfields issue. What are we going to do for reconstruction? You'd have to ask the state for additional money for reconstruction and oversized infrastructure. It would require significant amounts of cash. I'm not sure where the legislature would be with that model, given the overall tax model of the state of North Dakota. Other states have a higher income tax. The state collects that income tax, and then they're able to distribute more money back to the local cities. That's a paradigm shift for taxation. Once again, it's a policy issue. One of the other ways you could do it, some states have refunding improvement bonds with GO backing, and so you would have legislation to make a GO refunding improvement bonds so that you could spread a portion of the total cost of the improvement on your GO levy. So, for example, in Minnesota, they have a minimum assessment of 20% of the total cost of the project. So some cities choose to only assess 20% of the project and then put 80% on the levy. This can be a policy challenge in itself because you're figuring out as a policymaker who you're going to tax. Do you put the assessment on the people benefiting to a higher degree, or do you spread it across the entire city? Policy decision, but that's an alternative model. You could have specific legislation allowing for impact fees for new development. This would deal with your oversized infrastructure. It's not altogether clear in North Dakota if impact fees are permitted. So from my standpoint, having specific legislation that would allow an impact fee. And for a little bit of background, what an impact fee is if you have a developer that puts in a development, you would then have the authority to require that they pay an impact fee for the oversized infrastructure. So you would come up with some formula, and it might be, say, $1 million that goes into a fund that's used to pay for the future road expansion. I'm not saying that's something you should or shouldn't do, it's just another model that's used in different states. One basic fundamental one is just don't undertake the project. And I don't know if that's a valid one or not, but there's always the decision that we're not going to undertake the project. You could change your paradigm. I've thought about this for a long time. How do you limit your special assessments? Vertical development, limit lot size to small lots, narrow roads, and focus on urbanization. I don't know if that's politically popular or popular with the residents, but that's one way to reduce your special assessments and increase your overall taxes. The other options that we've explored a couple years ago, we proposed putting together what is called a special service district. And a special service district is used by many other states. They're very popular in Colorado and in Florida and to a certain extent in Texas. And those districts are essentially an improvement district that's run by the developer, where the developer has the ability to impose a fee, to impose a special assessment, and they sort of stand or fail on their own. So the district can issue a bond, and if the developer's not successful, the bond defaults rather than having the city default. We had proposed that to some legislators. I think it ended up in committee, and it didn't really go very far. Street utility fees, legislative authority. Some states have played with the idea of giving legislative authority to cities to impose a street utility fee. So just like a water utility fee, you would have the ability to charge residents, I'm just going to pick a number out of the air, $25 a month, and that would go into a fund that would be used for reconstruction of streets throughout the community. That's the end of my presentation. Sorry I went a little bit long, but if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Don?
Yes, good morning. You made reference to some of the call terms and stuff. Who actually benefits when the interest rate is lowered on some of those, and then what happens to any of that money that's in that particular improvement district that's excess or when it's paid off at the end?
Well, I'm not going to comment on any specific community, but in general, the lower interest rate generally benefits the property owner by lowering the overall cost of their assessment amount. The amounts that go into the fund are pledged to repay the bonds, and typically any amounts that go into the fund are used to pay off the bond. If there's additional funds that in the bond can be paid off, generally the assessment district is ended and the bonds are paid off. So in some small communities, we've seen the last year of assessments, they just don't levy because they're able to pay off the bonds. Some communities treat that a little bit differently, but that's the generally how it's handled.
Eric?
Real quick though, John, in Fargo, if we have excess funds after the bond is paid, it goes either to the general fund or somewhere else, correct?
I don't know. I'd have to defer to Kent.
Kent said yes, so thanks.
Rick?
John, I can speak to the fact of when the specials are applied to the lot and when they're not applied to a lot from a resale standpoint. If I use a home in particular for an example, if the homeowner has paid off their specials, they in turn, their expectation when they sell the home is they will get that value back. In reality, what happens when they pay off their specials is they have a home that's across the street that hasn't paid off their specials. Their home may be $400,000. The other one is $350,000 because they haven't paid off their specials. And when people are looking at the market, they may look up to a certain price range, and they may disregard the other house at $400,000. real estate professionals are very good at explaining that to them, but they may not even get the opportunity because they may not even look at that $400,000 house. And I assume that's also what's happening with lots.
Jim?
I just wanted to clarify, John, that with what you just said, that one option is to use that excess money from the refunding of bonds. There's a delta from a lower interest rate or excess money that could be used by the city to reduce that actual district and the burden on the homeowner as opposed to going somewhere else.
That's certainly a policy decision by the city.
Thank you.
Kurt?
I just had one quick question on the Century Code. Does it require the municipalities or the cities to use special assessments, or are there other tools in the Century Code that can be utilized?
Great question. The Century Code does not require you to use special assessments. If a city had other sources of revenue available to pay for its projects, it could certainly use those revenues. Use the example of some western cities. They get the gross production tax. They use most of the gross production tax to pay for the infrastructure, and they carry very low amounts of special assessment debt. So they'll rely upon their sales tax debt or sales tax revenue, utility revenue, and then the gross production tax. Unfortunately, I don't believe we're getting a lot of gross production tax here, so it's not really a good option, but you're not required to.
I was just coming back to your point in your last slide there where you had an option for the road fee or whatever it was called. Just want to make sure that was a possibility in North Dakota.
There's not specific legislation authorizing it right now. I would be concerned that if you tried to impose a street utility fee, that somebody would challenge it, and they would probably prevail, given the North Dakota Supreme Court's view on authority under Home Rule Charter. You'll recall quite a few years ago, there was a case regarding traffic fines in which the cities tried to increase the traffic fines above what was permitted by state law, and the court said that wasn't permitted. I would be concerned about having a street utility fee. The Minnesota legislature had been contemplating a street utility fee, and Minnesota has a more liberal interpretation of Home Rule Charter authority, and it was even felt there that absent that legislative authority, a city still wouldn't have the ability to impose a street utility fee. With the legislative session coming up, it's one option. I think if you had legislative authority for it, it's another tool. You would still have to determine how much that street utility fee should be per month, and you'd have to look at your engineers and say, how much money do we need, and what's the right amount to charge to a resident, what's politically available. But to me, it would be better to have specific legislative authority to do it. Right now, there's no legislative authority to specifically do it.
Bernie, and then we'll go to Blake.
To Mr. Bolus's point, the research that I've done, the cities do not do any additional follow-up or with regard to when a bond is assessed. If there is excess money, as Mr. Bullis suggests, that's not tracked anymore. That is closed, and if it's a 1% or 2% or 3%, there's no additional tracking on that the public can find out if a $10 million project and actually the city takes in $11 million. There's no tracking once the assessment bonds are issued.
There should be, if the city finance department should be able to identify how much you've taken in special assessments versus being paid out. You can only take in the principal amount that's assessed.
I understand that on the assessment, but for the administrative fees, engineering and all that, there's no more additional tracking beyond that.
At the beginning, when you assess out the project, that should be included in your resolution directing the levy of, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question right.
I understand that, John. My point is that the end result of this, so if the assessment was 11% for engineering and 3% for administration or whatever the case might be, the final numbers aren't tracked. So the numbers are in there to begin with of what it should be, but the real cost of what the project was as compared to what was collected is not tracked.
What's supposed to occur is that, so a good example is you're finishing up a project and the city goes out and levies the assessment for total assessment is 10 million and the total project costs come in at $9,750,000. That $250,000 that's bonded for, that's supposed to stay within the sinking fund, and that is just allocated back to repaying the bonds. Typically, in your bond documents, it requires that any excess money that's bonded for that district stays within that district. And so what will happen is if there's enough money left in the fund, the city just won't levy out the last year's assessment, and that gets used to pay off the bond early.
So what is the reference that it's going back into the general fund, as Mr. Gehring has said?
I'd have to defer to what Kent, because you were talking about specific City of Fargo policies.
May
Lori?
I just do an interpretation of clarification? Last week when we met with the engineering department, and they said for engineering, they applied 10% of the project cost for their engineering costs. But then we asked what the hard cost was for engineering, do they track that? And they said, no, they do not track that. Their hours that they put into the project. They just assess across the board 10%. So I believe that's what Bernie is referring to.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification. We're kind of talking about two different issues. So I don't know how Fargo specifically treats it, but in general, most of the cities that don't have engineering departments, they just put whatever their hard cost is from the specific engineering firm. For those cities that have their own in-house engineer, you're right, a lot of them will just charge a strict percentage fee, and that just gets pushed back into the budget for the in-house city engineer. I can say with most of the cities I represent, they have private engineers that do the work, so it's just a hard cost that goes directly into the fund. But there are a few cities I represent that have an engineering fee, and they just charge it. They don't track specifically how many hours are in it.
John, I have one more question.
Yep, then we'll go to Kent, and then we'll get into Blake.
From your experience with the private sector engineering compared to the City of Fargo's engineering 10%, can you tell me of the project cost? Do you have a feel what the private sector is charging?
Yeah, we've seen, it really varies based upon engineering firm, and it really varies upon the agreement. So some engineering firms are in the 11 to 16% rate, and that includes design, construction management, oversight. I have seen some as high as 18%. So 10%, it would really depend upon, does that include construction management and oversight or design? If it includes all of those items, that's very, very competitive. If it's just design solely, then it's slightly, the private industry is anywhere from 6 to 8% on design, but it's hard because you don't know what the extent of that is. And I'll just use an example. Oftentimes, if you have an in-house city engineer, they will design the scope of the project, and so they set the parameters, and then they send it out to the industry, and that 6 or 8% is based upon that scope, but doesn't include that scope drafting. If you include the scope drafting and you tell the engineer, go draft the scope and figure out what the project is, sometimes they'll come in higher. That might be 10 or 11%. So it's, without knowing the specific facts behind what the engineering department is doing as part of that 10%, it's really hard to say, that's high or that's low. But it's not out of the ballpark with that one.
Kent, did you have some comments on the?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to comment on the city's policy with regard to the fees. It is simply a policy-based percentage, and it's applied to the construction cost on the front end of the project. So your percentage times your cost equals the fee you charge. There is really no internal tracking of that because it's set by policy. And what John had just suggested is there's a wide range of engineering costs associated with deployment of it, depending on you have your own in-house staff or if you have a private outside staff. And I think we've always, from Fargo, looked at those that are doing it privately, what are they paying? What's an approximate percentage? So that is applied. I will be talking on some of the analytics and showing you some of the numbers in our next presentation with regard to how much we collect in fees and how that relates to the cost of the engineering department's budget. If you're to use that as one analytic to try to discern the level of revenue generated from this. And the other comment about at the end of the bonds, by state century code, that money can be or may be, there's some fuzzy words in that, transferred to the general fund, but there's 3 or 4 sections within the century code to suggest that the bonds need to run the term of the bond, and then any residuals at the end go to the general fund. And that makes sense, because what are you going to do with the money? I mean, just let it sit there? And it's funny to follow the state law too, because at some point in time, that language was added to the century code that said, put it in the general fund, because that has an indirect benefit to all the taxpayers and an ability to work that into our budget and take that amount of money in. So I just wanted to add those.
Super. Thank you, John. Thank you, Kent. Blake?
The ending discussion we just had, I thought that Commissioner Greenberg had a copy of this, perhaps not. Let me just hand this around. It shows special assessment fees in various cities. Came out, that's what John said. I didn't want to change that to the package.
Good to have 2 copies.
Pardon me?
Good to have 2 copies.
And we go. Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to have some time with all of you. And I especially want to thank those of you that are serving on the task force. You have a very difficult task ahead of you. I know that we are scheduled to be out of here by 9 o'clock, so I'm going to do my best to not repeat anything Mr. Shockley said. We did not have a chance to compare PowerPoints prior to this morning, so we have a lot of items in common. So with that, basic question is, Mr. Cosgrove has said that he's done this 15 years ago. The legislator's been looking at special assessments since 2001, 2002. Why has no solution been found? That's because a replacement vehicle has not been found. And special assessments have been looked at up, down, sideways, back and forth. There is no magic elixir for special assessments. This is from the Interim Taxation Committee. Some language, and I have a handout on that. It is highlighted, it's a single sheet, it's highlighted in yellow. This is some of the language that came from testimony. Actually, it's kind of a gold color. I will not read that. You can read that on your own, but that is something that, some conversation that came out of the 2011-12 Interim Taxation Committee. Mr. Shockley mentioned fees and taxes. The last legislative session saw fit in the House to add this language, and it's on another sheet of paper that I handed to you. It's highlighted in green. Century Code ordinances enacted after August 1st of 2017 may not allow for the collection or levy of any tax not otherwise specified in the section, and this section is the home rule section. And legally, fees are construed to be the same as a tax. So we're stuck on that point. As Mr. Shockley said, there's 2 groups of special assessments. I call them greenfields and brownfields. Greenfields seem to cause less heartburn amongst the general population than brownfields do, which is the reconstruction or the repair, maintenance, and replacement. There's very few options for calculating cost. One of the things that Mr. Shockley alluded to and that I would encourage the committee to look at is what are your fixed costs in the special assessment process versus your variable costs. Some costs you have to have, like construction cost. You don't have much flexibility there. That's a fixed cost. You should also look at issuance costs, advertising, bonding, carrying costs, the time value of money, If you opt to special assess, you basically become the bank. The city is the bank, and there's carrying costs. There's time value of money. The market bond rating. You purchase the bond, it's not a variable rate bond, it's a fixed rate bond. Bond market review costs money. And what are the collection costs for the city? What if somebody doesn't pay? There's an administrative cost to that. What is the history or the trending in Fargo of your sinking fund, which was the discussion we kind of ended up with? What if somebody prepays? What if somebody doesn't pay? As you've done special assessments over the last 10 or 15 years in the city of Fargo, what has been, how much sinking fund revenue do you have to have so that you don't have to go with a deficiency levy at the end of the bond? There is at least one state that has a 30-day window to pay in full. If they pay outside that window, the property owner has to pay the remaining balance of special assessment plus the interest. Not like making a prepayment on your car. They have you prepay the interest along with that because it helps offset that bonding cost that goes forward that Mr. Shockley referred to. Are there other issuance costs? I'm sure that Mr. Koskin could fill in the blanks here. And we talked about the risk factor. There has to be some revenue set aside to deal with risk. There is a certain amount of risk, especially in a greenfield, if something goes south and a developer has to walk away. Special assessment fees, the handout that I gave you a second copy of, you can see there's annual interest, there's administrative fee, engineering fee, quality testing and inspection. I would presume that most cities that have an engineering department such as Fargo would not accept any infrastructure that the developer has completely paid for without a very thorough and adequate inspection. And then there's your internal legal costs that are always associated with going to the bond market. New infrastructure. Every state in the union has some sort of a League of Cities or League of Municipalities, so I reached out to them on our listserv and asked them if they had special assessments, if they did not have special assessments, what were some of the alternatives? Most of the states that responded back to me for greenfield, that new construction, they make the developer pick up the cost. And then it turns over to the city, and the city has to do the reconstruction costs. So that is a possibility. It has been discussed. You'll see in some of the minutes I handed out to you. It has its bad side and some good side, but it's something that I think you want to have a thorough discussion of with lending institutions and with developers. Here's some questions that I would ask if I was on the committee. How much tax-exempt property does Fargo have? When you do a special assessment, how much that road is going to go by through, is going to drive by some tax-exempt property like NDSU? Somebody's still got to pay for that, but it's tax-exempt. Are special assessments being subsidized? Yes. Okay, from where and how much? Mr. Costin can tell you that. Do you want to differentiate a subsidy on greenfields versus brownfields? Is a subsidy sustainable? A very critical question. If you're going to subsidize, is that revenue stream a permanent revenue stream? You have some caps. You have, there's information on City of Fargo's website that shows all the different products that can be special assessed. Not all of them are at 100%, some are at 50%. I would suggest that you look through that document, and if you have questions on it, address those to the city folks. Where am I at here? Impact fees. Mr. Shockley brought impact fees up. Right now, my understanding is that impact fees are not allowed. It would take special legislation to use impact fees in the place of special assessments. Some states do allow impact fees. Florida's a big impact fee user. Mr. Shockley brought up lot size. Maybe you need to look at smaller lots, because that lot is, unless years down the road, somebody buys 2 lots, tears both houses down and builds in the middle, the size of your lot directly impacts what your special assessments are going to be forever and ever. I would also suggest that you look at a construction cost graph. I'm not sure that the general public, and there's no reason for them to probably, has an adequate understanding of how construction costs have increased over the last 10 years. And that has a huge impact on what your special assessment fee is going to be. Now, you're going to pay some Bakken premium again. There is no doubt in my mind, because there's a limited number of engineering construction firms. They're going to go where the money is. So when you start to bid out, your bids are going to come back higher than your engineering estimates. We're already seeing that. I talked to an engineering firm a few weeks ago. It had to do with water projects. Bids were coming back in 30 to 50% higher than engineering estimates. That is something that is not controllable by the city. The construction cost, as Mr. Shockley's graph showed, is a 70% bite. That's the big elephant in the room. Now, you can subsidize it, general revenue bonds, GO bonds, city sales tax, but again, you better make sure that you're not taking from Peter to pay Paul. I think you should look at the impact of deferred maintenance. I know that Fargo has a capital improvement plan. What is the deferred maintenance costs on an annual basis? There has been a tendency to perhaps not do as much maintenance as is necessary because there's always some legislative pressure on property taxes. And if you're going to do maintenance outside of special assessments, you're going to have to turn to property taxes. Then that brings the legislature into play, and again, they like to dabble in local property taxes. The basic is infrastructure costs money, and the price is not going down. One of your roles should be to make sure that you educate the citizenry to the extent possible as to all the pieces of the special assessment process. They need to understand that if you buy a 50-foot lot and 10 years down the road, the road needs to be repaired, you're going to pay less than if you have a 100-foot lot. I think that's something that needs to be explained, pamphlets, brochures, I don't care how you do it, but special assessments are not an easy animal to understand. Mr. Shockley brought up special service districts. I am going to leave the chairman, Gridberg, with an overview of special purpose taxing districts. It was brought up at the end of the 2015 legislative session. It was Senate Bill 2375. There were a lot of problems with it statutorily and procedurally, so it did not go forward. He'll copy this off and give each of you a copy. This is a marketing piece, so be careful, read it with those lenses on. This is a marketing piece. They go by a number of different acronyms. But if you want to look at it, I'll give you the information. Would I suggest you address it? Based on what I've heard from my colleagues in Florida, Colorado, and Arizona, where they're very highly used, they're not very happy about them, especially if there's a real estate downturn. Arizona and Colorado were left holding the bag on a lot of these special improvement districts. Street utility fees. The city of Bismarck has discussed such a animal. I would suggest that perhaps for your next meeting, you have the city administrator.
Services including free rapid HIV testing, STD counseling, testing and treatment, pap smears, laboratory tests, contraceptive counseling, immunizations, hepatitis C testing, testicular exams and education, pregnancy testing,
The information they have, and especially the process, because it was a very public process that Bismarck went through to look at how to fund their annual road maintenance. It was only for streets. Will it fit the restricted language that was put into the home rule? Probably not. So I think they're looking at a half-cent sales tax to specifically set aside for just street repair and maintenance. Now, I brought a yellow sheet with me. I'm going to finish with that. It's a yellow sheet because it's caution like a yellow light. Couple of things. Special assessments are going to be addressed in legislative session. There's no doubt about that. There will probably be a piece of legislation to disallow some political subs from being counted in the protest area. You have a special assessment district, 51% of it is the park. The park district would be excluded, the amount of park district acreage would be excluded from the protestable area. Because if the park district owns 51% of the special district, it basically becomes non-protestable. I expect legislation on that. An option, and I would tread somewhat lightly here. North Dakota has difficulty in wanting to bond. Perhaps an alternative, Mr. Shockley brought up funds from the state, is to be able to bond through the Bank of North Dakota. That is being discussed in different flavors. That might be an option that we see come through the next legislative session. Bonds strictly for infrastructure. As that moves forward, and I do expect there to be some conversation on it, you saw it from Senator Hogue and Representative Striley on using some of the legacy fund money for water projects because of the flood situation in Minot. I do expect that to be a part of the conversation. I've been doing some work with the Bank of North Dakota. I think we have a very reasonable and workable option that takes some pressure off the taxpayers if we can bond using some of that legacy fund money. Legislatively, though, I saw in your minutes that the final report may be presented to the legislature. I would be very, very cautious about proceeding along that line, again, because the legislature likes to dabble in local politics, and because the legislature sometimes has a tendency to look at everything being a one-size-fits-all and a cookie cutter. And I do not want Fargo to be held out there as, what the heck did you guys do to me? Because Fargo is not the same as Grand Forks, which is not the same as Rolla, my hometown. Special assessments are a local government situation. There are some statutory requirements. Yes, we need those statutory requirements. But I would not be pleased if all of a sudden we saw a bill that says, hey, this is what Fargo's doing, this is what everybody has to do, because it's not going to work for everybody. So, again, I urge you to have a great deal of legislative caution when you, for whatever final product you come up with. I hope you come up with a final product, or at least have an understanding that this may be as good as it gets. Some of my other states, they do use, again, as I said, the special improvement districts. They have some economic development situations. They get money from the state, so there's a combination. But infrastructure costs money. So with that, I'm sorry I talked fast, and I hope you listened fast.
Questions for Blake?
I just have one quick question. You talked about square footage on protests in the state century code. That was brought up earlier, that you can protest it, right? And if you have to have 51% not do the project, how is square footage calculated versus what's assessed? I believe there's a conflict in the Century Code that I might only have 49% of the rights to protest it, but I get hit with 54% of the bill.
I can't answer that. That is, somebody would have to look at case law to see how, or testimony that came into effect when that particular square footage designation was put into place. So I would maybe perhaps ask Mr. Shockley to do a little case law investigation on it, unless somebody in the audience behind me knows the answer.
Dan is smiling. Or John?
I've actually had that issue come up before. And, we've had challenges where landowners have made a similar challenge. The shape of the improvement district just needs to include the area that will be benefited and assessed. The vote isn't proportional to the amount that's assessed, because you won't know the amount that's assessed when you create the improvement district. And so that's the problem. Like, there's no way that you would, because all you have is an engineer's estimate, you have what you think your estimated costs are, and you'd be voting based upon the engineer's estimate, but it could come in less, it could come in more. And the process is set where you create your improvement district, and then it's up to the assessment commission to figure out how to levy it. I suppose you can make the same argument in that a property owner, I'll use one example, they owned a lot of the property, but they got a small assessment because they had vacant undeveloped property, but they could still protest out the whole improvement district. And so there's no proportional weighting of the protestability of a district based upon the final amount that they would be assessed. And I'm not sure legislatively how they would go in and change that, given the timing process between creation of the improvement district and levy of the assessment.
Yes. My thought on it is you're using two different methods to measure it today. For a protest, it's based 100% on square footage, because it's called out in Century Code as area. But when it comes to the assessment of the cost, it's left up to the city or whoever, the Special Assessment Commission, to decide how to break it up. In a local road, the city of Fargo does a 50-50, 50 on this side, 50 on that side. And it's two different tools being used.
Well, that's the current state of the law, is that it's based upon area. And I mean, we'd have to look at if there was legislative changes that would need to be made to that. That's something that would have to go to the legislature to change.
It'd just be nice if there wasn't a disconnect there.
Well,
That's that sort of information that we are looking for as representatives of the cities when it comes to legislative activity. There are some things in statute that maybe don't make a lot of sense.
That's why I brought it up.
If they can be fixed, then let's get it fixed, so we don't have to quit biting around the edges.
Don? Do you have a question? Or Dan, follow-up comment?
When it comes to improvement in district in Fargo, as Mr. Gorski, yes, the protestability is by a square footage. But as you put in those roads, and dirty rule of thumb, typical rule of thumb is 50-50, but you have different service, you have street returns. One side of the street might not have a return, the other side may. That's an added value that's going into that other side of the street. So is it a pure 50-50? No, it's typically what you say is half the road goes each direction. But there are different additives in there, services sizes. One side of the road might have 10 services in an industrial area, 6-inch services. The other side might have 1-inch services. So the difference in the services goes to the other side also. So we compensate for all those different sizes. Equivalently, though, it is done on the longevity, consistency, and uniform basis.
Thank you.
That goes back to my starting comment that special assessments were an easy fix. They'd have been fixed a long time ago.
Just a follow-up comment, Blake, to your point about, our role here and the impact and statewide perspectives in the legislature. I believe that the city commission would have the expectation and hope that we look at our timeline with a report in December that has legislative recommendations. And so I might take a little different approach. I appreciate, your perspectives, but this is a difficult subject. But if we're going to make change, as I think you would have gathered from today's presentations, largely it's going to require legislative change. And whatever you decide to come up with in recommendations, we have to have that as an end game that is part of the City of Fargo's legislative strategy. And I think on behalf of at least one city commissioner, and Commissioner Garrick and I on this commission, we're going to advocate for those changes. And I believe that the entire city commission would on recommendations and what makes sense to move forward to do business differently. And I think that gets back to the premise of Commissioner Garrick's perspective. We have to look at legislative side of this as a way to navigate through any substantial change. And I think your mention of Bismarck, I think we would like to bring in Bismarck and Grand Forks if that's appropriate. You think that would make sense to hear what they're doing at a future meeting. But I think legislatively it's going to be a top priority as well. With the underscore, in my opinion, local control, but allow us to be flexible.
Commissioner Grinberg and I dealt quite a bit when he was a senator and I was a lobbyist, so we have disagreed on other things through time, but we'll continue to have our differences, I'm sure, but they're not differences that are going to cause any great heartburn. I am just, as Commissioner Grinberg, when he was senator, understands, one size does not fit all, and the issue in Fargo did raise this to the legislative level. Any statutory changes certainly need to be dealt with, but any policy procedure changes, they're for Fargo.
And as a member of the family and League of Cities, we want to work with, you as well as, other cities to advance change. Okay, next meeting, I suggested September 27th. That's not hard, fast. As we shared the last meeting, Commissioner Garrick will be participating via conference call at future meetings. So having two meetings before his training, I think that's what you're going out for training, that we have this discussion as a baseline. So I throw that out for other thoughts on next meeting date. Later in September, I think, is what I would believe is helpful to Kent Costin as he's preparing the data and the presentation and the analytics on a deep dive on finance. But I'll open it up for your thoughts.
So 27th's fine.
All right, so we're going to stay with, I know, Bernie, you're going to be traveling 27th. We'll stand with September 27th. Any questions that come up, let either one of us know between Diana and Shelley at the City Commission office, and Commissioner Garrick and I. We have contact information. We will continue to communicate electronically, but we'll have the sole agenda item then is strictly a deep dive in finance between engineering costs as a cost center, as a revenue center, and the bond, maybe a dabbling in the bond financing and how that all comes together. Make sense? We are adjourned.
Crime prevention through environmental design, or CEPTED, is a